At this time, we're going to have the chairman's report as well as the superintendent's report. We're going to combine that to make certain, thank you, Dr. Vitti, we're going to have a combination, and then we're going to also ask the board's legislative liaison for the Florida School Boards Association, Mrs. Couch, to chime in, because there are some very important legislative items that we feel that the public needs to understand right now. Members of the school board were in Tallahassee last week, and we had an opportunity to meet with all of our Duval delegation members. And some of the information that was shared regarding upcoming legislative items, we felt it was necessary that we combine our reports because it's critical to all of our children. The first item we're going to talk about is House Bill number 5105. House Bill number 5105. And what it talks about is the school improvement bill summary. And what it initially is talking is going to impact 115 D and F schools across the state. The turnaround schools require, the turnaround schools requires districts to enter into an agreement with a charter operator after 2 years in turnaround if they remain in turnaround for the third year. What this bill is proposing is that the legislature take $200 million for Schools of Hope, that is an outlay of the Department of Education. They're calling them the Schools of Hope, to assist charters with costs such as startup costs, teacher compensation, professional development, and extended school years. So they're talking about taking $200 million of taxpayer dollars and giving into one pot for Schools of Hope created via the State Department to now come into districts and in essence take over schools. And we're going to go through this process to show you how they are proposing to have this happen. It will allocate the hundreds of millions to incentivize high-performing charter networks from across the nation or this country to locate schools in Florida communities where traditional schools are, in their view, failing, in their view. The other provisions of this bill that can be very harmful to not just our district, but any of the districts where these 115 D and F schools across the state entails. One, repeals certain statutes that hinder high-performing charter schools from replicating. Charter schools would be exempt from certain state teacher certification requirements. Exempt from certain state teacher certification requirements. Now, they're talking about students in a school that has a letter grade or D or F, but yet they're willing, through this House Bill 5105, to exempt the charter school operators from certain state teacher certification requirements. It allows charters local facility funding currently available to traditional public schools. So they're going to take funding from traditional public schools because they say we're not doing the job. They're going to give them to somebody else. And then the charters could take over a school instead of building a new school. The charter school could relocate a school within 5 miles of the existing public school that is closed and would not be required to provide transportation. So they can come into Duval County, take over a school, and then say the Duval County has to now provide transportation to students to that school for them. So in addition to taking away the funding from that school, FTE, etc., now it will also take money from other schools and other students within the district, because now we've got to take transportation funding out of our pot to provide for those charter schools. The schools that are impacted in Duval County are 3 schools. Now, earlier I said there were 115 across the state. Ribault Middle School, Matthew Gilbert Middle School, and Northwestern Middle School. If these 3 schools do not receive a grade of a C or higher this school year via the Florida assessment, then the district could be required to close the school and select a Hope Charter School operator if they apply. What does this mean? This means that the charter school Hope operators can take over a school or underutilized space in district buildings without community input, and the district will be responsible for maintaining the building. So again, your input as taxpayers, as students in some of these schools, as community residents, your input is not important according to this House Bill 5105. Charter schools will be eligible for the Schools of Hope revolving loan program with the Department of Education for construction funds. This will create duplicate facilities in the district. So we could get a School of Hope, they could build a building, 3 years later they are not as successful as they had hoped, but they've used taxpayers' dollars to build another facility at the taxpayers' expense. Charter school operators will be given 5 years to turn around the school. If unsuccessful, the school will revert back to the state, not the local school board. Reverts back to the state, not the local school board. Allows national data to be used when forcing districts to select a Hope operator, even if the operator has a history of failure within the district or the state of Florida. So what that says, if there is a charter school called Dennis Charter School, and they have not been successful in Duval County, but they have shown success in another state nationally, they can still be required to take over the school, even though they've not shown success right here in Duval County. Allows the Hope operator to determine the cap for enrollment, the number of students that's in that school, therefore causing less capacity for the current students. So we are tag teaming tonight, the superintendent and board member Couch and I, because this is critical. And here are some of the things that you can do to help derail this, because this could really impact our district. Again, I want to say, of the 115 DNF schools across the state, only 3 of our schools, all unfortunately middle schools, are maybe impacted by House Bill 5105. It is important that you contact your legislators, and it is important that you really focus on your senators, send them all the email, because this is the 5th week of the legislature. So we still have time if we pull together as a community, and when I say community of public education, not just Duval County, so that we make certain that they understand this is not something that we may want as a community. If you're going to use our tax dollars, we should have a say-so. So the information is online. Also, we're asking for social media. Please use your social media accounts to inform others about the proposed legislation, and then advocate. Please, if you can, visit Tallahassee and let your legislators know what you think. The legislators will be home for about 3 weeks, starting
3 days. 3 days.
3 days.
Starting in 3 days.
No, be home for 3 days. You said 3 weeks.
Oh, they're home for 3 days. I'm sorry. Thank you.
Starting next week.
Starting next week, they'll be home for 3 days. I encourage you to take the opportunity to go and try and visit them while they're here in Duval County, so that they can see your face, they can hear your voice, they can feel your passion and feel your commitment to public education. And at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Beatty.
Thank you, Ms. Wright. Just to ground everyone's knowledge base regarding the school improvement process for low-performing schools in the state of Florida, right now it is called differentiated accountability, or sometimes you'll hear the acronym DA. There are 3 major categories right now where schools are placed. A group of schools are called focus schools. Those are schools that recently received a D. And then there are priority schools, which received a grade of an F. And then a turnaround school is one in which is implementing a model of reform in order to improve the school grade to a C or higher. So once a school, this is the timeline, regarding the process currently in statute. Right now what happens is a school, as I went over in the previous slide, is designated as a focus or priority school when the school is an F or it receives 2 consecutive Ds. Once that happens, the school goes into a planning year in collaboration with the district to plan in ahead or in advance if the school's performance continues to decline or be in the range of a D or an F. So during that planning year, you're thinking about what you might implement differently as far as the turnaround model. If the school grade does drop or stays the same, meaning it's a D or an F, then you go into implementing year 1 of that turnaround plan. Then you have 2 years under that model to reach a C. Once you reach a C, you exit that turnaround process. If in 2 years you're not able to achieve that C, then you have to select the new turnaround option. And so the turnaround options that are currently in statute are reflected in this slide. The option that is usually used by districts is the district managed turnaround option that usually requires you to remove or replace a principal and a large portion of the faculty. Closure is clear. You close the school and those students are reassigned to other schools. You can turn the school into a charter. You can hire a private management company or an external partner to help you turn that school around. Or the last option is a hybrid option, which it combines 2 of the options from 1 through 4. This is what currently is in statute. For a bit of background, prior to this structure, the differentiated accountability process only had 4 options. Those options were 1, 2, 3, and 4. And back in those days, so not that far ago, but about 2010, 2011, communities like Jacksonville went through a significant intervene process, if you recall those days. And schools were identified to close based on perceived low performance. There was significant pushback by communities about not having an option to stay open, even when improvement was being demonstrated. And the state legislators in the House and the Senate, and even the Florida Department of Education, recognized that the 4 options were limited. And that's why they expanded it to 5 and also created more time for schools to show improvement. So obviously the bill that is currently in the House that Ms. Wright reviewed is a perfect example of legislator amnesia, in that it neglects the work and the process that led to the current structure of low performance, or how to deal with low performance. And it accelerates the process in which a school moves to a more draconian option as far as turnaround is concerned. So now this option basically says, or this process, this proposal, is that in one single year that you're a D or an F, and let me repeat, in one single year that you're a D or an F, you now move into turnaround mode, which frankly is absurd. So you could be historically an A school every year under the accountability system, and you may have a change in principal. A significant number of faculty members retire. Maybe they move to another school. Shift in demographics. Number of different factors that can influence low performance or a decline in performance, and now you're immediately in the category of low performing. If the school, then you have to implement a turnaround model immediately, which is probably district managed turnaround, and you only have 2 years to reach a C. If not, then you do not have these 5 options any longer. You only have option 2, 3, and 4. And it accelerates option 3, which is the charter, the closure option. And so let's talk about that in a little bit more detail. Before we get into the actual option, let's take a step back. So this is data that indicates the work of turnaround led by districts throughout the state of Florida. And you can see Duval County highlighted in blue. And thank you. I just got a cough drop. So these are districts throughout the state of Florida, and you can see that Duval County Public Schools in the highlighted blue, in 91% of our schools that were identified as priority schools improved at least one letter grade. In addition to that, 55% of our schools exited the turnaround or priority status. That far exceeds other districts throughout the county or throughout the state. So not only are we seeing more improvement as far as letter grade improvement, but we're seeing more schools exit the priority status as compared to other districts throughout the state. And those highlighted in yellow are those that have 5 or more schools in turnaround. So we didn't highlight ones that only had 1 or 2 schools because that's rather insignificant. It's the schools that had 5 or more, and those with 5 or more, you can see that our percentages are greater. So in other words, the district's own turnaround work is successful. So it puzzles anyone that is committed to turnaround through traditional public education as to why we're thinking about radically shifting to now a different governance structure and a different model like charters if we can fix and improve our own schools. So if you look at the 3 schools that were mentioned by Ms. Wright that are considered hybrid schools in year 1 this year, if you look at last year's performance compared to the year before, and although we changed standards and assessments, Ribault Middle maintained its D but did show improvement in almost every accountability area. Gilbert moved from an F to a D, and Northwestern moved to an F to a D. So our most critical schools or our most low-performing schools are showing improvement based on the accountability system. When you can see throughout the state of Florida, you can see the number of schools that are in priority status. Our work over the last 3 years in particular has dramatically reduced the number of schools in priority status. So technically we only have 3 schools in priority status. We have 2 schools that you would find on a priority status list, Oak Hill Elementary and Hyde Grove Elementary, and those are there because we changed the model and converted the model at those 2 schools. Oak Hill is now a school that serves students with autism, and Hyde Grove is now an early learning center. So they are being monitored, but they're not quite in that priority status. So technically, we only have 3 schools in that area, and you can see that's much lower than other districts our size. For example, Tampa and Hillsborough has 9, Broward has 9, Polk County has 8. So those are some examples of districts that are about our size in comparison. Or Pinellas with 5, which has more than us, but a smaller district. So Schools of Hope, and it's important for the community to understand, the first version of the bill actually called these schools Schools of Success. And then they changed in the nomenclature to Hope because I think there was a realization that it's really hard to indicate that these schools are actually have a track record of success. Instead, they have track records of hope, I suppose. And so the $2 million, as Ms. Wright indicated, is only available to charter schools. Now, when you look at research, when we look at what needs to happen and what needs to be enhanced to improve performance, we know what works. More professional development for our leaders and for our teachers on everything from the standards to the assessments to interventions to cultural competency to literature or literacy, etc. Extended time for students because students are behind. More funds need to be used for after-school tutoring, before-school tutoring, Saturday school, or even extending the learning day. Higher compensation to recruit and retain those highest performing teachers and leaders to go to the most critical schools. Wraparound services for students, full service schools, mental health services, expansion of the arts, expansion of athletics are all examples of expanding wraparound services. More technology and equipment because of the digital divide. Developing pipelines for new teachers to work in our schools that are hard to staff, and new leaders to lead our schools, and then ultimately parent engagement. If we're going to spend money on something that works, let's spend money on these different areas with $200 million, not on hope. So, other challenges. There is no factual evidence, none, that charter schools outperform traditional public schools in the turnaround work. No data that supports that in the state of Florida, and very limited data throughout the country. So specifically in Jacksonville in the state of Florida, traditional district schools or traditional public schools in Title I outperform charter Title I schools, not only in Jacksonville but throughout the state of Florida. In addition to that, when you look at the proficiency of students, so those that are at or above grade level in reading and math, Title I schools, District 1 versus Title I schools charter run, our proficiency rates are higher throughout the state for traditional public schools, and they're higher in Jacksonville for traditional public schools. So why exactly then are we accelerating the process to define low performance, changing the governance model to a system that is completely unproven and untested in Jacksonville and in the state of Florida? We already talked about limited options, and we've talked broadly about accelerating closure. The research indicates that the best way to go throughout school improvement is to implement a continuous improvement model where you're constantly tweaking, refining, and improving what you're actually implementing, not simply looking at a quick fix to gain a C and then everything crumbles after you gain that C. This process negates research and what practitioners say will work regarding improving low-performing schools. Another concern, this deeply violates the authority of the local school board, which is elected. The only entity that should be authorized to open schools or close schools is the school board, not the state of Florida, not legislators in Tallahassee. The accountability system ignores, or this bill ignores, the fact that we've had, and I say dozens, we've had over probably 40 changes to the accountability system in the last, I would say, 6 years. So sometimes when you're looking at a school dropping from a C to a D to an F, or even a B to a C or a B to a D, it's really more about the standards changing or the assessment changing, not whether students are learning or teachers are teaching. So in other words, sometimes low performance is manufactured, not really based on performance. And then lastly, even if, which we don't, but let's say for the sake of argument, we assume that charter schools are the answer. So let's assume that's the case. From a very practical supply and demand analysis, when you are accelerating the closure of traditional public schools, hence increasing demand, the supply is not there to meet that demand through the charter work. So the greatest problem with thinking of charter schools as a turnaround option is that you may have isolated examples of Title I schools or Title I charter schools working. There are isolated examples of that, but the challenge is one of scale. So when you may have one great elementary charter school that's Title I, but if we're thinking about supply and demand, you have to replicate that enormously quickly. And that's the same challenge that districts face. We have great Title I schools that will outperform at the national level. Our challenge is replicating that great school in every Title I school, and that's about human capital. Time for the improvement process. Again, this is an isolated D or an F that moves into radical changes at the principal level, possibly the teacher level, and it is likely to create extreme chaos in communities, which we'll talk about in a minute. Less choice. If this process follows through, we know that the greatest schools that will be burdened by this are those that serve students in concentration of poverty. We may be looking at a situation where within one zip code, all middle schools would not exist in traditional public education based on this process in certain zip codes. This would then require students to get on a bus to go on the other side of town in order to go to a traditional school or even a charter school for that matter. And then inequitable expectations. Charter schools will have 3 years of D or Fs before they close, whereas we essentially in traditional schools only have 2 years. So what are the proposed solutions? One, keep the structure the same. It's working. In other words, we are already identifying low-performing schools. We're seeing improvement in those low-performing schools, as I showed you earlier in the slide, and it provides enough time to do what research tells us to do. Focus on what's not working, improve that, and create a sustainable plan that is about the continuous improvement model, not radical changes immediately. Use the $200 million that appear to be available on things that actually work, which we went over earlier. And if there's a perception or a belief, probably ideologically, that there needs to be more Title I type charter schools throughout the state of Florida, then fund that or allow that to happen in a normal fashion, meaning just how Jacksonville KIPP has been created and has slowly developed. Then allow that to happen. Don't do it in a way that closes traditional public schools for charter schools. That's not sustainable and obviously unjust. So that was a lot, and it was important to understand exactly where we are and where we're possibly headed, because these things happen extremely quickly, and they are likely to move forward with very little resistance unless people's voices are heard regarding this issue. Mrs. Couch, I can keep on going, or do you want to?
I just want to add and focus on that there is a 5-mile radius around the school. So let's use Matthew Gilbert for an example. Matthew Gilbert sits on the east end. That 5 miles would include across the river all the way into Arlington. They would not even have to replicate a school to serve the students that attend Matthew Gilbert. It can exist on the perimeter of the 5-mile radius. So we have a situation where students, and it was asked on the floor, we attended the meeting, it was asked on the floor, will you have to provide transportation to these students? The answer was no. So students will then have to find ways to get to school that can be 5 miles from the actual school that they were attending, and their school is now closed because the state has required it to be closed. Also, it was asked on the floor, do they have to take all of the students? The answer is yes, as a priority in their lottery system. However, they can cap the enrollment for the school. So let's use Northwestern as an example. If there's 500 students that attend Northwestern and the school closes and we have to allow a charter school, and we have to pick the charter school. If they say they want to be in our building, we have to pick them, or else we get, basically they take our funding away and we can't do that. So what happens is they can say, the charter operator can say, we only want 350 students. That leaves several hundred or 150 students who now we have to relocate and find another school for them to attend. No sports teams anymore. And it doesn't matter if you made the football team for spring jamboree, because if that happens, it's going to happen to your school the next year. That's why it's so important for the community to know about this, to be aware, and to take action. Because this bill is moving fast. One of our senators that represents Duval County filed the Senate counterpart to this. Senator Aaron Bean filed the counterpart. He did withdraw his legislation, but he has the same language that he had proposed in a bill, and he's one of our senators. So he did withdraw that bill, so currently there is no Senate counterpart, but there is a bill written, and it's waiting. So it's really important that you guys contact your Duval delegation especially.
So the other topic that is linked to the legislative process this year is the expansion of capital outlay dollars for charter schools. Currently, the only capital dollars that go to charter schools are PICO dollars, and then separate allocations at the state level for charter schools in capital outlay. But at the current time, the capital outlay dollars that are distributed to districts remain in the district. There's two main important factors related to this possible change in allowing charter schools to receive capital outlay dollars. One is that we're at an extreme disadvantage right now regarding capital dollars to upgrade and upkeep our current facilities. The second greatest challenge is that many of you know that charter schools often are run by for-profit entities. And if a charter school is created, hypothetically, with taxpayer dollars, as far as the initial investment, and down the road that building is sold, those dollars would not necessarily go back to the school district. they would go into the pockets of investors that were linked to that original construction. If we build a school building and decide to close the building or sell the land, that goes back to taxpayers' dollars because that goes in the district coffers. That's not private profit. So there are two bills right now in the Senate and the House. They're fairly similar, but there are some differences. The way that the proposal works is that you would take the total revenue from the local millage, divided by the number of students in the charter, and then that would equal capital funds per student. Then you multiply that number by the per student calculation by the charter school eligibility. And then under this proposal, the charter schools would get 50% of maximum allocation automatically, plus 25% if 75% of the eligible students qualify for free and reduced lunch, and then another 25% if students are eligible, or if 25 students are eligible for ESE. And the kicker, and something that is extremely concerning, is that districts would have to give charter payments immediately on July 1st. The way this works, and this is a bit in the weeds, is usually you pay over time or over quarters. To give that funding up front would severely handicap the district as far as how it has dollars to use throughout the course of the year. So instead of thinking about how you pay your mortgage or your car loan, you pay that over time, not at the beginning of the year. Imagine if you had to do that as an individual citizen, you would not have dollars to pay for other things throughout the course of the year. That's essentially what would happen with this proposal. So there are some differences. In the Senate version, there are restrictions for eligible charter schools, and that goes into who can be on a board, if their family members related to the board. The bill does not take into account debt service for the district. We'll talk about that in a minute. A lot of our capital outlay dollars go to debt services to buy for technology or to do major improvements or renovations to schools or to build new schools. The funds can be used to pay for a lease and to improve privately owned buildings. So charter schools could receive money, pay lease payments out of that, or even give money to a private business or a private company that has a building and upgrade that. And that would not be, obviously, that enhancement would not be a benefit to the school district itself. So the House bill requires that the charter school is open for at least 2 years before receiving dollars, at least not immediately. Requires debt service to be deducted first before charter schools receive their dollars, unlike the Senate bill. And then it requires the charter school to have no more than 2 consecutive grades of lower than a B, unless the school serves a high number of students that are qualifying for free and reduced lunch. The only thing that I think is important in this is that on the House bill, it specifically caps the revenue at 1.5 mil, and it does allow for the allocation to occur later than the beginning of the school year on February 1st. I do want to show you this because I think it clearly demonstrates what we could be possibly looking at as far as loss of revenue for capital funding. And this was a chart that we created with an earlier version that still could exist through this process of giving charter schools capital dollars. Right now, our mills are at 1.5, so we generate about 86.7 million. You see that toward the top. About 32 million of those dollars go to debt service. So if one of the versions of the bill goes through, charter schools would receive 30 million of those dollars. That would leave the school district for its traditional public schools, 160 buildings plus other buildings, only $24.6 million to deal with major minor maintenance. And so look at that contrast to 86.7, which is now still insignificant considering we have a backlog of over $100 million. So I know this sounds dire because it is. There is no more important investment than your infrastructure. Think about your own homes or the property that you own. The stronger your infrastructure, the stronger your asset is and the long-term investment that you have. We are only as strong as our infrastructure and our buildings, and if they begin to deteriorate, not only is it a safety concern, but it's a long-term investment concern for our children. And then these are the different scenarios that play out. So even if the mill were increased to 2.00, generating $115 million, 15 of that would go to charters, leading us to 68.8, which is less than if the mill stayed the same at 1.5. I don't know what in two numbers are more stark and should wake you up to the reality of what could happen in these scenarios. Mrs. Couch, I know that you probably are eager to jump in on this.
So this bill, and we shared this particular slide when we visited Tallahassee, and it did seem to resonate when they saw it on paper. There's two important things to remember. The House has been adamant when we visited they will not raise millage because they believe that's a tax increase, so they will keep it at 1.5. The Senate has a second bill that they released at the same time as this that would allow school districts to raise the millage to 2 mills. It has not been heard in a second hearing, which means it's dead. This bill is still moving. So we're basically stuck at the top line. That's where we are. And from the previous slides that the superintendent showed, 0.5 mils is what we would have to share. It showed that in the slide before. So we have $120 million worth of major and minor maintenance. Part of that is due to the fact that traditional public schools are required to have specific facility upgrades. When you pull up to a school and you see the covered awnings that go out to the bus loop, that's a requirement by the state. When you see some schools have covered walkways out to portables, that's a requirement by the state. We are in a backlog just to meet those requirements. We also service hurricane shelters, and I'm sure a lot of citizens appreciated the fact that we do service hurricane shelters this past year. Charter schools do not do that. We have requirements for our facilities so that we can be hurricane shelters. We have requirements to meet the state criteria for our facilities as well. Charter schools do not have to do that. So they don't have the same restrictions on how they spend these dollars as we do. Part of that money can also go towards technology upgrades. So you can have someone that owns a building that is being leased by a charter school, and they spend this money, this capital money, towards technology upgrades for the building. They fail, and then they have to close, or they decide to close, because that happens too. We had that happen this year. And that building, which has been completely renovated and upgraded with technology, does not come back to you, the taxpayer. It goes back to the private owner of that building. So there is no investment from you, the property taxpayer. It's your property taxes that will be invested in privately owned facilities that will then benefit the private owner of that facility. It sounds like a great deal for the privately owned, the person that owns the building, but not for you, the taxpayer. And the infrastructure, that's why we have millage. It's to build the infrastructure for your communities. It's not to take away and hand out. So it's really important that that you contact your legislators for this, because you can see where we have $24.6 million on this chart. That's to take care of the $120 million backlog, as well as the growing log of repairs, roof replacements, fire, sprinklers. These are things that we have to protect the safety of our children. And we will only have $24.6 million to accomplish that for all of our buildings. Our district is one of the oldest districts in the state of Florida. So we have an average age of 50 years. I think it's actually higher now, but 50 years is about the average age of our buildings. So also that comes with more money, and you have to do improvements to your buildings. We have to show in a capital plan that there's a need to build a school. Charter schools do not have to do that. So they could actually use this money to build a school directly across the street from a school that has space for students. And one other thing that I think is important is that the charter schools, the Senate bill says, and I'm going to reiterate this, that we have to pay those funds up front. That means we have to take those funds from other areas in our budget that pay for maybe textbooks, salaries, those types of things, to give them that money up front. Some districts may not be hurt by this because they don't have charter schools. They do not take into account how many charter schools you have either, which is creating a huge burden on districts like ours, Miami-Dade, Palm Beach, Broward, Hillsborough, who have a lot. They're saturated with charter schools. It's usually the more urban school districts that have a saturation of charter schools.
Thank you, Mrs. Couch. So this is the Duval delegation. So please contact them if you're concerned about the things that were discussed today. And lastly, there right now are, I'll get there. There are 3 proposals regarding next year's budget, at least from a starting point perspective. You have the governor's budget, which increases per student funding by about 3.2%. You have the Senate's budget, which increases per student spending by about 2.7%. And then you have the House budget, which essentially declines per student funding by 0.7%. Although there's an overall increase, there's a decrease when you look at per student funding. Mrs. Couch alluded to this already. Essentially the difference between the governor and Senate's budget versus the House budget is the dollars are there to fund what the governor and the Senate is proposing. The difference is a matter of ideology and commitment, in that right now for the House budget to pass, it would reduce the tax burden at the local level rather than just essentially keeping it the same, because it's viewed as a tax increase because there has been a surplus in revenue from the previous years. So this is a significant difference. Obviously, when we go about balancing our budget, if we're talking about an increase of nearly 28 million versus only 3, obviously decisions would have to be made going into next year, especially when considering possible changes with capital outlay. Thank you for your patience, and hopefully you are more knowledgeable about some of the bills that could make a critical difference in the lives of our students and our communities.
Thank you. So I hope that you take this information at heart, and please contact your legislators. As I said, when we went down, Board Member Hershey, Board Member Couch, Board Member Jones, and myself, we had an opportunity to meet with each one of our legislators and discussed in depth these concerns, but they need to hear from you. And the value of this school board meeting is to bring you information in terms of how the local connects with the state. So the local reacts or is responsible for implementing what the state says. So we don't want to be in a position to be trying to play catch up when we look at how are we going to meet not just the academic needs of our students, but the social and the emotional concerns and needs as well, because it's all about money, it's about funding, and how we can take that funding and create an environment of learning that grows within our community and help us to build a stronger, more productive community.